Gayle Forman is a best-selling, award-winning author of young adult novels. Leave Me is her first novel for adults. Her novel, If I Stay, won the 2009 NAIBA Book of the Year and was a 2010 Indie Choice Honor Award winner. The film adaptation of If I Stay was released in 2014. Gayle is also a journalist whose articles have appeared in numerous publications, including 17, Cosmopolitan, and Elle. She has visited more than 40 countries and written a nonfiction book about her travels titled You Can't Get There From Here. Boy, do I feel that way when I'm traveling. A year on the fringes of a shrinking world. She lives in Brooklyn, New York with her husband and 2 daughters. Welcome, Gayle.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Well, I have to tell you, I was very, very impressed because I was reading my current issue of O magazine, and guess what? There was your book as one of Oprah's picks. Did you know that?
I know. Oh, of course I knew that. That was brilliant. I think I might have cried a little because Oprah and books doesn't really get any better than that.
Well, I know. I mean, that was really, I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. So that was wonderful. And I welcome you to the show, and it's really wonderful to be interviewing you. But, you've had such success as a young adult novelist. What made you decide to write an adult novel? Because, in fact, I really should ask you, is there a difference when you're writing a young adult novel and an adult novel? I mean, is your mindset different? Do the words come differently? I guess what's the big difference there?
I suppose the biggest difference between my young adult novels and my adult novel is that there's less sex in the adult novel. Because as I like to tell people, it's a book about middle-aged married people, and I write contemporary fiction and realistic fiction. But and I like to also call Leave Me my first novel starring adults, because there's a lot of adults who read young adult, and particularly my young adult, and a lot of teens that read adult novels, so I didn't want to discount any of them. But the reason I wrote Leave Me is that when I sat down to kind of get started on the next book, what I wanted to write about was marriage and motherhood, and there was no easy way to do that in the way that I wanted to do it, without aging up my characters so that they were more my age group. So that was what made the decision. That was the inspiration for it.
And then where do you get your inspiration from? I mean, I do a lot of writing, but I've never written a novel. I don't think I ever will write a novel. I've written I've written 5 books, but they're all really about business or by things I coach on or teach on. And so I just wonder, where does a novelist get the inspiration in the first place?
I think it's different for different novelists, and I imagine it's not that different from, what inspires you to write a book, which is there's something that you want to work through. So what happens with me is I have all these ideas for premises and ideas, and then what happens is a character comes along, and when those two things collide, that's when a book is born. So with Leave Me, the original seed happened about 5 years ago when I was on a family vacation with my husband and 2 daughters and our really good friends and their 2 kids. And it was this beautiful, idyllic, beachside house, and we'd have these wonderful dinners at night around this table. It was like Martha Stewart. And I was
just going to say, it sounds like a movie already.
I know, right? Or Nancy Meyer movie, exactly. So I would excuse myself from the table, and then I would go up to one of the guest bedrooms that had the best cell phone reception, and I would Google heart attack symptoms and, when to call an ambulance, which, by the way, right away, when you're having chest pains, which is what I was having. And it was more worrisome because my mother had her first bypass surgery at 48, and she'd had no symptoms and no risk factors before, in spite of risk factors aside from some really bad genetic luck. So it has always been in the back of my mind, like, is this going to happen to me too? And as I was contemplating this, having to have that bypass surgery that she had, I got really scared because I had these 2 young kids, and I was the default mom. I worked from home. I took care of them. I did all of the things. And who was going to take care of them if I needed to have this surgery, and who was going to take care of me? So it really started as a revenge fantasy, but then when I finally saw a doctor and had a stress test, everything was fine, and it kind of cooled. But it came back many years later, and with the character of Mary Beth Klein, the main character. And right away, her voice was very clear in my head. She was a sort of droll, overworked, overworked, harried mom who didn't really have time to dwell on how bad things were because she just didn't have the time. And once she came to me, that premise remained the same, and the novel took off and went into directions that I didn't anticipate.
Wow. So from idea in your head to the words down on paper, how long does it take you to write a novel?
Well, they percolate in the back of your mind, I think sometimes subconsciously. So with certain books, I tell people If I Stay took 7 years and 3 months to write, because for 7 years, that essential question of, like, what would you do if something catastrophic happened to your family and you had to choose between, and you knew something had happened to them and you could choose whether you were going to live or die, that question kind of spun around in my head for 7 years. And then one morning I woke up and there was this character, Mia, and from that point on, it was 3 months until I had a draft. But it had really been living in me clearly all this time. With Leave Me, the idea started about 5 years ago. But when Mary Beth kind of came back to me, I would say it was about a year between sort of starting afresh and finishing a pretty polished draft.
I think it's fascinating that you're able to put these words down on paper the way you do. And you had one of your novels, turn into a movie. Are you consulted in that?
With If I Stay, I was, definitely. I worked with the producer, Allison Greenspan, and the director, R.J. Cutler. As we move forward, I think increasingly people in Hollywood, particularly with young adult, I'm not sure if it's the same with adult, they understand that the readership is passionate and can really boost a film, and that the novelists and the authors, we don't necessarily know how to write a screenplay. I don't, but I can at least kind of be the ambassador between the readers and the filmmakers, guiding them to the parts of the books or the characters that I know really resonate, and trying to kind of figure out new and fresh ways to tell a story in a different medium.
I would think that when you are the original author and they do adapt something, I would think that it would be very difficult to sit by if they kind of tweak your characters in a way that you had not meant them to be. And I'm just curious what your mental state is when they're doing something like that, or if you really have some kind of psychological something you go through when that happens.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I was just having this very conversation with somebody. With If I Stay, I felt really fortunate because the tweaks that they made really had nothing to, the characters survived the transition from page to screen intact. And there were definitely tweaks with the plot and which elements of the storyline we chose to focus on, but the characters really felt like the characters. And that was important because If I Stay was such a personal story to me. So when there had been talk of drastically changing the characters or going in directions that didn't seem true to the work, I would have rather not had the film made. But luckily, it was made, and it was made with a real faith to who the people were on the page. With other things, what happens is, I'm less concerned if the characters are tweaked than if the characters as they are on the screen feel real and authentic. Sometimes films are very different from the book, but they work in an entirely different way. And I'm not, averse to that, but it is difficult. I think there is something really hard about taking a character on a page where you have so much room to really develop them in multiple layers and where so much can happen internally, and bring them to the screen where it has to either happen very subtly with facial expressions and the acting, obviously, or with this screenplay, which has such heavy lifting to do. I have to say, seeing a novel adapted made me understand just how difficult it is to write a good screenplay.
Wow. That's wonderful because it shows an appreciation from you to other writers who are totally in a different genre than you are. But, my feeling, I'm wondering about yours in terms of when you meet booksellers, and you go into bookstores. I mean, everybody is talking, well, it's the big word, everybody, but many people are talking about the fact that you really can't find your neighborhood bookstore anymore. And they're at a point where they say, well, people don't like to read anymore because we're in such a fast society. How do you feel about the writing of books and the future of books? Let's just put it like that. What do you think about that?
I've been hearing this for a while, and definitely the sort of the neighborhood bookseller took a big hit from both big chain stores and then the rise of the ebook. But they've really stabilized, and there's some really, really thriving independent bookstores these days, and the ones that have come back stronger than ever. So I think that shows that while books and reading may evolve, that they're not going anywhere. The human desire to be told stories and to create stories, I think, is as old as humans themselves. So I think that it might change. Maybe the younger generation will be more apt to read electronically, although that hasn't been my experience. I think young people seem to be more attached to the paper book than their parents. So I don't worry about that. That said, when I go into bookstores, as an author, I find it a hugely anxiety-provoking situation simply because I think, like, oh, my God, look at all those books. Like, why would anybody ever choose to read mine? And so I feel incredibly privileged, particularly when I meet booksellers who hand sell a book, which is, the booksellers who know their customers and say, oh, you should read this. And I have my local bookstore that I go to, Word Bookstore in Brooklyn, and they hand me books. And so to know that sometimes my books are on the receiving end of the bookseller's hand sell is incredibly gratifying and humbling.
Well, I think it's wonderful that they're coming back because I am still the person who likes to have a nice book in my hand. I mean, I have a Kindle, but I don't use it to read books. I like to have that book in my hand. I like to be able to turn the pages. I like to be able to highlight certain portions. I like to be able to do all those things. But when you first started writing young adult novels, did you have any idea that the readers would identify so strongly with you?
No, I didn't. And, my first young adult novel was published in 2007. It was called Sisters Insanity, and it sort of came out quietly. But also, young adult had not become the huge thing. I don't think maybe Twilight books had just started to come out, but they weren't this huge success. We had Harry Potter, but that was a different thing. And so when I wrote If I Stay, I first of all, I wasn't even sure it was going to be a young adult novel. I wasn't even sure it was going to be a novel. I remember when I started working on it, it felt dark, and it was told in this nonlinear fashion, and it didn't seem viable to me, but I felt like I needed to write the story anyhow. When I saved the first draft on my computer, the file name was Why Not. I have like a weird superstition about a novel not giving it an actual proper file name for quite a while until I know it's a real thing, but I saved it as Why Not, as in I don't think this is ever going to go anywhere, but why not? So when it actually went out into the world and had this profound effect, on readers around the world, it was kind of shocking and humbling, but also it makes you understand that there is sometimes there's a universal feeling or concern that you tap into, and you never quite know which book will do it, and this one did.
Well, that's wonderful, and I'm just wondering, we have a lot of people listening who are probably, shall we say, closet writers. This is something they've always wanted to do, and yet they say, well, the same thing you said, who would read it, or can I do this? What kind of process did you go through to get it published?
So my first book was a nonfiction book, and I had been a journalist before then, so I went through that process a little different. You write a book proposal for a nonfiction book. So I wrote a book proposal and sample chapters, and this was back in the day before email was really prevalent. So I, sent all these packages to different agents, and got eventually found an agent to represent that work. With a novel for first-time novelists, I tell people you really need to kind of complete a draft and then make it as good as you can. So I think, critique groups are incredibly helpful. I know a lot of authors who publish many books that still rely on their critique groups first and foremost before it goes to an agent, before it goes to an editor. So I think that that's what you need to do. And then I also tell people, in spite of the fact that when I go into bookstores, I kind of freak out. When I see everything, I try to write the story, not to sort of say, oh, look, that's selling or that's selling, because everything's so cyclical that the thing that's hot now, 2 years later, which is, the soonest your book would ever hit a shelf, it's something else. So you just really have to write the story that you are desperate to tell, whether it seems viable or not. Why not? Just write it. And I think the stronger the work is, the stronger you're feeling about the work. It shows and it translates to the page. And you put the cart, behind the horse, not before the horse, so that you make the work first and then you worry about the process. And there's lots of great resources